Okay? So at the end of May, Narendra Modi and the BJP won re-election to another 5 years in the center. And I think going into the election, a lot of people, their expectation was that Narendra Modi would be re-elected, but people said that maybe his majority would be a little bit smaller, maybe he would even need to form a coalition government. I don't think people necessarily expected that he would actually increase the number of seats that he had in the Lok Sabha, now over 300, and also increase the total percentage of votes that the BJP got in India. So after the election, I think a lot of people wrote pieces asking the really important question of why does the BJP win? Right? So why did they win in 2014, and also why did they win re-election in 2019? So this just mentions a few different theories. Of course, after the election, a lot of stuff was written by Indian political scientists or journalists or theorists trying to explain why Modi wins. So I'll just mention a few different theories. So one theory is that the reason why the BJP wins is because of what's called India's new middle classes. This idea that the middle class in India really likes the BJP and really likes Modi, and especially for nationalistic reasons. So this is an argument that has, for example, been made by Pradeep Chibber, who is a political scientist at Berkeley, and he's looked at a lot of national election survey data. And he says that what we see is an alliance basically between middle class voters. So that would be, I mean, that term can be amorphous, but it means people who are, let's say, small shop owners, small business owners, they vote for the BJP. And they have an alliance with people who are very religious. So that is really what explains why we see an increase in the BJP's vote. Second argument that people make is they'll say that the BJP is a high caste party. And that what they're slowly trying to do with Hindutva is expand the base of the party to include lots of different new caste groups, so OBCs and SCs, for example. So how does an elite party get poor voters to vote for them? One argument made by Tariq Kachil, who works at Vanderbilt in the US, he says that the BJP uses what he calls non-party affiliates, like the RSS, to basically give out public services to poor voters, and therefore try to get them to vote for the BJP. So a lot of people after the election said Hindutva is no longer just about the upper caste, it's now spreading to lots of other communities. It doesn't matter what your caste group is, you might still vote for the BJP. Prashant Jha has written this book, How the BJP Wins, and he talks about some very different factors. He says, first of all, even if you don't like Narendra Modi, he's charismatic. And in India, you have charismatic political parties. And so one thing he mentions is the Congress Party has not had a charismatic leader since Rajiv Gandhi died. So on the other hand, Modi is very charismatic. Maybe a lot of people respond to that, and that's one factor that helps the BJP. It is better organized than the Congress Party. It's better at making alliances, and you have weak opposition parties. So technically, since 2014, there has been no opposition party in India because the Congress Party hasn't even been able to cross 10% of the seats in the Lok Sabha. So when you think about all these explanations, the really interesting thing to me is how seldom religion is actually mentioned as a potential cause of why people vote for the BJP. Chibber mentions it a little bit, but he says it's really more about middle class voters. The thing that's interesting though is if you think about the BJP and how it became powerful in national politics in the first place, it was through religious style mobilization. Right? So this is Advani on his Rath Yatra, this is the Ram Janambhoomi movement, right? The Ram birthplace movement. And it was, of course, it culminated in 1992 with the destruction of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya. But it was sometime after that that the BJP eventually won national elections in Delhi. So obviously religion was quite important, religious imagery, religious symbols, all of the mythology that surrounds Ram. They were very important to the rise of the BJP, and yet I think most theorists are not really sure how important religion is in explaining the rise of the BJP. So what I'm going to try to do today is answer kind of two big questions. So one, what is the effect of Hindu religiosity? By that I mean how religious a Hindu is on the rise of the BJP. And then second, how does Hindu religiosity explain other kinds of political behaviors? the way people feel about secularism, the way Hindus feel about Muslims, for example. So I'm looking at the effect of religion on a number of different political behaviors in India. So I'll just give you a kind of a broad overview of a book. This will hopefully, at some point in the future, be a book project. So it combines different kinds of methods together. So some quantitative methods, mainly statistics. I'll talk a little bit about that today, but also qualitative research. So the first thing that I do is try to develop a new measure of Hindu religiosity, right? So I'm a professor in the United States, and most of the work that we do on religion and politics is really about the Abrahamic religions. So we really spend a lot of time studying Judaism, Christianity, Islam, but Hinduism is very understudied, at least in the US Academy. So how do we know the difference between a very pious and a non-pious Hindu? How would we make that distinction? Do Hindus even make that distinction, right? So I did some ethnographic field work to try to develop a measure of Hindu religiosity. That's the first thing. The second thing is I picked two very, very different states, okay, Bihar and Kerala, states that are usually never compared, because they're so different, but to try to get maximum variation on this question. So Bihar, if you look at the Human Development Index, is one of India's worst performing states, and then Kerala has historically been one of India's best performing states. I put this in red because that's all I'm going to talk about today. I wish I had more time to talk about everything, but I'm just going to basically focus on how I developed this measure and then show you some results based on my research in Goa. I did a survey in each state. When the survey is completed, it will be about 1,000 people per state using a stratified random sample. I'll explain a little bit what that means in particular. And then the qualitative side of the project involves participant observation during survey enumeration. So I went around with the survey firm. Maybe about 50 or 60% of the time they were in the field, I was with them. So I watched a lot of the interviews, and I sometimes asked follow-up questions. So for example, of the over 900 people that I surveyed in Bihar, only 3 of them said that they did not believe in God. So I wanted to interview and speak with those people because they're very interesting respondents. So I did some of those follow-up interviews. And right now, the reason why I'm in Kochi is doing ethnographic fieldwork with urban families. So I picked Patna and Kochi as kind of the most developed cities in Bihar and Kerala, and I'm doing research in 2 urban neighborhoods in both of those cities. But I'll just mainly focus on what's in red here. So my survey in Kerala is not finished because of the floods. It got a little bit delayed. So you're going to have to hear about Bihar instead of Kerala. Okay, so, sorry. Okay, so in the United States, because we mainly focus on religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, if I'm thinking about how to measure how religious a person is, the 2 main questions that we ask people are, number 1, do you believe in God? And number 2, how often do you go to synagogue or church or mosque, right? So very often, scholars will take these measures and just kind of haphazardly apply them to other religions. So they'll go to Japan and they'll ask people, do you believe in God? Do you go to temple? And scholars have come to India and they've asked the same kind of questions. Do you believe in God? Do you go to temple? These measures are, of course, as I'm sure you know, very problematic in a tradition like Hinduism, which is quite complicated. So first, a pious Hindu can, of course, be an atheist, right? You don't meet a lot of people in the United States who call themselves Christian atheists. There's just not that many of them. But in Hinduism, of course, you can be an atheist, so that question might not be as meaningful. Similarly, there were a number of Hindus I spoke to who said that they never go to temple. They have a puja shelf in their home, and they do all of their rituals at home. They never really need to leave. And so, going to temple is also maybe not meaningful to people. Also, if you go to a temple, very often there's no pujari there, and usually there's no sermon or anything that's similar that you find in the church. So you can't just take those measures and apply them to Hinduism. You have the same problem, of course, with just the word religion that we use, the word dharma, which can be translated as religion, but also all of these other things, social usage, morality, justice, righteousness. So are we even really talking about the same concepts? So what I wanted to do was try to build a measure of Hinduism from the ground up. Instead of kind of going back and reading the Mahabharata or something, I wanted to just go to villages and ask people what they thought about their religion. So what I did was, I went to some villages outside of Patna in Bihar. This is just an image of what one of the mandirs in this area. And I found two villages that were extremely similar in a host of kind of demographic characteristics. They have around the same population, the same kind of caste groups, same level of development. And I randomized two different versions of a survey, both across and within these villages. So one group of respondents got questions that were based on the national election study. So a question might be, for example, how religious would you say you are? Not at all religious, somewhat religious, very religious. And people would say, I'm somewhat religious, or they say, I'm very religious. In the other version, I gave them the same questions, but open-ended. So I would just say to you, how religious would you say you are? And people would look at me and they would say, I'm 100% Hindu. Or people would say, I'm not at all, they would give me different kinds of responses. So I wanted to compare our academic understanding of Hinduism and the understanding of actual Hindus. So I'll just show you one example of what this looks like. So I asked a question about rituals, right? And there are about 11 different words in Hindi that translate as ritual. I used the word rasma, right? Dharmik rasma. And on the left here, what you see are the National Election Study responses. So I asked people, do you perform the following rituals? So I said, do you give religious donations? 96% of people said yes. They could be lying, but that was their response. I said, do you perform puja? 90% of people say yes. Do you visit the temple? 90%. You see a lot of very large percentages, right? 75% of people fast. Then I used the same exact question where I said, what are the rituals you perform? And I didn't give them any options. So the number one response people said was, what is a ritual? They said, I've never heard that term before. They know what a ritual is, but they don't know the kind of academic vocabulary that we're using. So sometimes we had to help them. So I would say, you have a puja shelf in your house. Does that mean you do puja? And they would say, yeah, okay, that's a ritual. I get it. And then they mention other things. So you can see the only similarity here is puja. That is something that almost every Hindu says, so we know that's very important. But the percentages really drop for the other things. So people mention going to festivals. People mention their attire. So women would say, I put colored dye on my feet, or I wear anklets. Men would say, I wear the tilak, right? People don't really mention fasting. And most of the people that mention fasting are women. More women fast than men. Almost a very small percentage of people mention going to temple. That was not an important ritual that they ever talked about. And people often said, one of my rituals is I obey my parents, and I think about my ancestors. So as you can see, there's a major discrepancy here between like the way social scientists in America or maybe even in India are thinking about Hinduism and how Hindus actually think about it. So I tried to see about similarities and things that come up in the open-ended version of the survey, and try to build a measure of Hindu religiosity from the ground up, basically, right? One that is ethnographically informed. So what I did was I came up with 14 questions. You can tell me what you think about the questions, although I can't change them now. But they're agree-disagree questions. So what we do is when we meet somebody, we read them these statements, and then we say, do you agree or disagree with the statement? And usually they will say, I agree or I disagree. And then we say, if they say I agree, we would say, do you completely agree, or are you just kind of somewhat in agreement? So we're trying to measure intensity, right? So completely disagree is 1, completely agree is 4. So I spoke with a lot of religious studies scholars. My wife is a religious studies scholar of Hinduism. I shared the survey with them. I tried to base it on ethnographic research other people did. So here are the 14 questions that I asked. Okay? So the first 4 questions deal with the sense of community that Hindus have. So in Christianity, for example, people in the United States who are Christians might not have the sense that there's a huge Christian community in the country. But Hinduism is what you might call like an ethnicized religion. A lot of Hindus just think of their Hinduism in kind of purely cultural, community-based terms, right? So being a part of the community, you're born into it, right? Whether or not you can convert, that's a complicated question. But for the most part, it's an exclusive club. Like, I can't join Hinduism, really. You have to be born into the club, right? So here are some questions I asked. So I asked people, I would marry someone who is not Hindu. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? I would marry someone from a lower caste, because most Hindus marry within the same caste. It is important for me to teach my children about Hinduism. How do people learn about their religion from their parents, right? This last question, I put a star here, is because it's reverse worded. So I'm trying to make sure the respondents are paying attention. So I would say it does not bother me when people make fun of Hindu rituals. And so most people, when they hear that, they say, no, it does bother me. So then we'd say, okay, so then you disagree with this. I'm just trying to make sure that they're not just saying yes to everything, right? So you want to try to confuse them a little bit. Okay? So my point here is that a Hindu who would marry outside their caste, marry outside their religion, doesn't teach their children about Hinduism, doesn't care if people insult Hinduism, we might say that person is less pious, or maybe that person is more secular than your average Hindu. Okay? I'll show you people's responses to these in a second. Now the next 5 questions are about rituals that people perform. So I ask about fasting. I say, this is important for receiving God's blessings. Do you agree or disagree? When I was doing ethnographic research in Bihar, I asked people about these life cycle rituals, right? Samskaras. So what's the most common samskara that you do in your life? And most people mention doing mundan, right? Where you shave the head of a child. And so I said, it is auspicious for parents to do this tantra ceremony for their child. Do you agree or disagree? Okay, so that's a question about a very common ritual. I asked about darshan, right, the sight of the deity. How important is that? I say the best part of the Chhat festival, so that is the biggest Hindu festival in Bihar. I say the best part of this festival is that I get to buy new clothes. So sometimes people who are very religious, they would say, no. Buying clothes is not the important thing. You're supposed to pray, you're supposed to do puja, you're supposed to think about God, right? It's not about buying clothes. Other people would say, yeah, I want to buy clothes and hang out with my friends. That's what the festival means to me. So my interpretation is that they are a little bit more, they view this as more as a secular rather than a religious ceremony, okay? And then the last question is about a very important distinction in Hinduism, which is about purity and pollution, right? So certain things are ritually purifying, certain things are ritually polluting. So temple entry. I actually broke this up by gender. So for men, I said, do you agree or disagree with the statement? I would not enter a temple if I just lost a family member. Usually Hindus wait somewhere around 13 days because that's a time when you're ritually polluted. So if you don't care and you immediately go to a temple, maybe you don't care about pollution, right? You don't believe in ritual pollution. For women, I said I would not enter a temple if I were menstruating, which is a time women are not supposed to enter a temple. Okay? So these 5 questions were about rituals, and then the last 5 questions were about Hindu beliefs, which I think a lot of people say Hindus don't have any beliefs, or they have like such a wide range of beliefs that it's hard to ask these questions. I think there are certain common things that maybe Hindus would believe. So one is just a belief in God. Most Hindus, you can be a Hindu atheist, but most Hindus are theistic. They believe in one God or various gods. So I believe that God blesses me when I do puja. Here's another reverse worded question. So I do not need to consult with the astrologer or the pundit before fixing a wedding date. So usually people said, no, you gotta consult with the pundit. You can't fix a wedding date on the wrong date because then you get divorced. You have to ask the pundit what is an auspicious date, right? So people would disagree with this statement. This is about the Buri Nazar. So when something bad happens to me, I worry it was caused by the evil eye. Ask people if they believe in that. This one is actually a question about caste, because very often higher caste groups in India have vegetarian diets. So I asked people in Bihar, as a Hindu, I should only eat vegetarian food. And there's more of a movement with like some of these Hindu nationalist groups to try to get people to eat vegetarian food. So I asked, do you agree with this? And then the last question is, an atheist can be a very moral person. So one of the translations of the word dharma is morality, right? Your morality comes from your religion. So if somebody says, yeah, you can be a moral person and be an atheist, that means that there are secular sources of morality. But usually most people say no, right? They get offended at the idea that the atheist can be a moral person. So what does the actual distribution of responses to this question show? So I just take everyone's scores for each question and I assign each person a score between 1 to 4. So you see, most people are pretty religious, like 3.5, like they get closer to 4, right? So this is what we'd expect. I mean, Bihar is a poor state, it's a developing state. Most of the survey was done in rural areas, so you would expect most people to be quite religious. And you can see almost nobody is purely secular. There's nobody who answered 1 to everything, which probably should be accepted. Okay, so let me say, since you guys do a lot of survey research here, let me say a little bit about the survey method, okay? So it's a multi-stage stratified random sample. This might be a little boring, but I'll try to go quickly. So there are three stages of the survey. So the first thing that I do is I randomly I stratify the state by different geographical regions. So I'll just show you a map of what this looks like in Bihar. So in Bihar, there are 3 different cultural historical zones based on the dialects that people speak. So you have Bhojpuri, you have Magadhi, and you have Mathili, right? You also have Angika spoken in some areas. So I stratify the state into these 3 regions, and then I randomly select 1 district per region. So in the Bhojpuri region, the district I get is Bhojpur. Now in Kerala, I do the same thing. I stratify the state between Malabar, which is the north, the Kochi area, which is in the middle, and then Travancore, which is in the south. And I randomly select 3 districts in Kerala also. And we do about 300 or so surveys in each district. So that's the first stage. So then we pick our 3 districts. So within the district, what I do is, the first thing I do is I look at what percentage of people live in urban areas and what percentage of people live in rural areas. Urban, of course, means towns or cities, and rural means blocks and villages, right? So let's just say a district has 50-50. So what that means is we'll do 150 surveys in villages and 150 surveys in towns. But the data that I have on urban-rural population comes from the 2011 census. And this is a survey I did last year, so I thought the data is about 7 years old. And I assume Indians aren't moving to villages, right? They're moving to cities. So I oversampled 10% from urban areas. So if the urban area was 50%, I actually surveyed 60% from urban areas. In Bihar, it's overwhelmingly a rural survey because some of the districts are like 70-80% rural. So we then, once we go to a town, we pick the district headquarters town, and then we randomly select wards within the town. And then within rural areas, we pick blocks and then randomly select villages between blocks. So everything is randomized at this stage. Once we get to a village, we use what's called an every nth household design. So let's say we're in a village and we need to interview 20 people, and there are 2,000 or so, 200 or so houses. We would then go like every 10 houses. So I would tell the enumerators, here's the first house on the street, knock on the door, see if we can do an interview, and once that's done, count 10 houses and go to the 11th one. And if they say yes, do the interview there. If they don't want to do an interview, or if it's a Muslim, this is only with Hindus. So if it's a Muslim house, don't interview them. Just go to the house on the left, go to the house on the right, try to get a survey from somebody else. Okay? So in villages, it was usually like every 5 or 10 households. Sometimes in cities, which are much bigger, a city board, it might be 15 or 20 households, right? And then the last thing I do is once we get to the household, a lot of these surveys are just done with the heads of household. So really you're only getting the view of older men, which can be informative, but 50% of the population is therefore not represented in the survey. So I split the sample between men and women. So about 48% of the sample is female. And so as soon as an enumerator gets to the house, they knock on the door and they speak to the head of the household and they say, I'm here with this American guy and we're doing a survey and can we do a survey in this house? So they'll say, yeah, go ahead. However, the response rate was around 90%. So most of the time people say yes. In Kerala so far it's like 70, people are a little bit more suspicious of surveys, so it's a little bit lower here in Kerala. So as soon as we enter the house, we use a gender balanced team. So we have 4 men and 4 women. So only men are interviewing men, only women are interviewing women. So the men basically say, how many men are in this house over the age of 18? So they might say there's 6 people here over the age of 18. So all of the surveys are done using Android devices, Android phones. And so they have, all the enumerators had a random number generator app on their phone. And so they would randomly select a number between 1 and 6. So let's say they got the number 5. They'd say, can we speak to the 5th oldest person in the house? Which would be maybe someone who's 18 or 20 years old. And so then we would try to do an interview with that person. Very often people would say, no, I don't want to be interviewed, interview my dad, he knows more about religion than me. And we would say, no, we're trying to get everybody's view on religion. So we want to talk to people who are 18 and we want to talk to people who are in their 60s. We want lots of different views. So this way you get variation within the house, okay? So you have the state level, the district level, and then the household level, and everything is randomized at each level. Like I said, here are the 3 districts. And now, finally, we can get to some of the actual findings, okay? So what did I actually find? So here are some summary statistics about the survey, okay? So let's actually start here. So Hindu religiosity is the main independent variable the main explanatory factor I'm interested in. So from a 1 to 4 score, the average, the mean here is 3.24. So like I said, most people come across as quite religious. And I surveyed a total of 914. I also later expanded the survey, so it will eventually be over 1,000 people. So the education, income questions come directly from the National Election Study. So I used the exact same wording and the same responses. So they go from 0 to 7 for education, all the way up to like postgraduate. 0 means no education, so very often women in BIHAR will say, I have no level of education. Or if you're interviewing farmers, they might say, I don't have any education. Income, again, for a lot of women, the income is 0, because they say, I work at home, I don't have any personal income. We also ask about household income, so you can use that in the analysis also. And as you can see, the averages here are very low, right? 2.6 out of 7, 2.7 out of 8. So low level of income, low level of education. The age, average age is 42 years old, about 43 years old. I was trying to avoid having the average age 50 or 60 years old, right? So you get a little bit of a younger sample. Youngest person is 18, oldest person is 93. So men are 51.6% of the sample. And then I also asked a question about everybody's caste, and then your official caste status. So this goes from 1 to 3. So 1 means that you're a scheduled caste or scheduled tribe. 2 means you're OBC, and 3 means you're a forward or a general caste. But I also have the individual caste group. So I think the biggest caste group in BIHAR in the survey is Yadav, right? Because it's one of the larger caste groups, and that's an OBC. Although you have to check this because there were a lot of Yadavs who said I'm a scheduled caste, and I would say that's not. According to the government, you are not. You are an OBC. So sometimes people don't necessarily know what their rank is. Okay. So now here are the main questions I ask about religion. I'm trying to see how religiosity affects various political behaviors. So the first thing I ask is, did you vote for the BJP, or who did you vote for in 2014, in the 2014 general election? Okay, I give them the list of options, and then I make a variable for, did you vote for the BJP? I do the same thing for the 2015, which is a state election in BIHAR. So they'll have their next state election next year. You can see the total number drops down to 600 because some people were not eligible. You know, an 18-year-old was not eligible to vote in 2014. But also some people would say, I don't remember. And so that means either they don't remember or they don't want to tell me. Because some people would just say, I can't, you know, they would say it kind of in a way that made me think they just didn't want to answer the question. Because, and we would always try to tell them, we're not from any political party. I don't work for the BJP. I don't work for the CIA. You don't have to be worried. But sometimes they would still say, I don't remember. I don't want to. Okay. But you still have over 600 people who answer these questions. Then I asked 3 additional questions. So I first say, do you believe that the government in India should treat all religions equally? So the official definition of secularism in India is dharma-nirpekshata, right? Religious neutrality. So all religions should be treated equally under the law. Obviously that's not always true in practice, but that's at least the basic idea. So I asked people, do you agree with the statement? 1 means not at all, 2 means somewhat, and 3 means I completely agree with the statement. Where I actually asked how important is it, so 3 is very important. The second question I asked is, should the government support Hindu temples? So if they ask what that means, I would say, should the government give money to temples? If a temple is in need of repair, should the government help to repair it? And then how important is it for the government to do so, from 1 to 3? And then I asked the same question for mosques, right? So if a mosque needs repair, should the government give money to support the mosque from 1 to 3? Now, I'll say that if you look at Hindus' responses to these questions, on average, the response is, as you can see, super high. So just take the response for very important. Religious neutrality, about 70% of Hindus say it is very important for the government to treat all religions equally. The question on temples, 80% of Hindus say the government must support temples. And then for mosques, I thought it would be much lower, but it's also about 70%. 70% of Hindus say, yes, the government should support mosques. So on average, so the average score is quite high. So if you want some good news, that's the good news, right? There's a lot of support for like Indian versions of, not separation of church and state, that's what we say in the US, but Indian versions of religious neutrality. There's a lot of support for Hindus on that. But what about the most religious Hindus? So here I do a statistical analysis. I'll try to explain what this graph is telling us. So just look at model 1. Okay, so here's a question about the BJP vote. So how religious you are is correlated. We can't say it causes you to vote for the BJP, but the more religious you are, that seems to be correlated with your likelihood of voting for the BJP, but the statistical relationship is very weak. So it's hard to draw inferences from that. So what else predicts voting for the BJP? People who are, I guess I can use this, people who are older tend to vote for the BJP. This is telling us that women are more likely to vote for the BJP. So after the 2019 election, there were some articles written about women for Modi and this kind of stuff, and women are supporting the BJP. So there is a gender dynamic. This is what we would expect here. The higher caste you are, the more likely you are to vote for the BJP. It's not a surprise. But the more educated and the higher income you have, the more likely you are to vote for the BJP in a national election. So that is an argument in favor of this new middle classes. That's evidence in favor of this new middle classes argument, right? Now, what's interesting is most of these variables are the same in 2015, but Hindu religion is now, the sign on the coefficient flips, it's negatively related. So the less religious you are, that's the effect of voting for the BJP in 2015, but it's also not significant. So it's hard to interpret what that means, but what it's telling us is that religion matters a little bit in national elections, but it does not matter in state elections. In 2015, if you were in Bihar at that time, people were not really talking about religion. We're talking about development and other kinds of things. So religion was not really that important in the state election. Now, the more pious you are as a Hindu, you are unlikely to support religious neutrality. The more religious you are, you disagree with the statement that the the government should support religious neutrality. You think that the government should definitely support mosques, but not should support temples, but not mosques. Your attitude changes there, which is maybe what you might expect. Now, when I talk to people, when I observed surveys, I didn't hear Hindus say anything negative about Muslims. I didn't hear them say they're not loyal Indians, they should go to Pakistan. I didn't hear any of that. All I heard was about this question, or about the mosques, or about neutrality. People would say Hindus are 80% of the population. Why should we be treated equal to Muslims who are 15%? Why should there be neutrality? We're the majority, so therefore we should get preferential treatment. So it's not that they didn't openly express prejudiced or bigoted views, but they just made a simple numerical argument. We're the majority, therefore we should get preferential treatment. If Muslims were the majority and we lived in this country, then maybe they should get preferential treatment. They probably wouldn't think that, but that's the basic idea, just majoritarianism. Right? Same thing with mosques. Some people would say, why would we support mosques? Muslims are 15%, why should we do that? Hindus are 80%, we should support temples, not mosques. Okay? So I want to be clear, it's not driven by animosity, it's just a simple, which group is larger, right? So the takeaway is basically that Hindus overwhelmingly support a lot of these things, but the more religious Hindus do not support religious neutrality and do not support the government treating temples and mosques equally, right? So there's a warning sign there. If the BJP is trying to make people more religious, then that could mean a lot of negative things for secularism in the future. Okay, so let me just conclude by mentioning some takeaways from this project. So the first thing I would say, and this really applies more to people in the US or people in the West, is that we need more non-Western centric measures of religiosity. Instead of just coming to India and saying, do you go to temple? I think whether a Hindu goes to temple or not is almost a meaningless question, because everybody has a puja shelf and everybody does rituals at home. So when you go to the temple, very often I would say, hey, you go to the temple every day, how often do you spend there? They would say, I spend about 2 seconds in the temple. So why is that meaningful, right? So we have to think about religion from the ground up, and I think an ethnographic approach is the best measure there. Now I started off by talking about Modi, so what does Hindu religiosity mean for the BJP? I would say it's not a very good predictor. Maybe it predicts a little bit in national elections, but in state elections it's not very big of a prediction. I went to some of the same districts in Bihar right before the 2019 election, and I asked people who were planning to vote for. So I'll have to do that analysis, but my guess is, once again, it's not going to predict very much. The last thing I would say is, while Hindus overall are supportive of secularism, the more pious you are as a Hindu, the more skeptical you are of secularism. This is all just based on Bihar, so I can't tell you about a whole bunch of other states, but hopefully in the future, I'll have more research funds so I can do more surveys in different states, and then we'll know more about this question. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attentiveness, and I look forward to your questions.